The wind came howling off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that November night in 1873, carrying with it the kind of cold that didn't just chill your bones. It buried itself inside your chest and squeezed. The kind of cold that killed cattle standing upright in the fields, froze rivers solid from bank to bank, and turned a man's last breath into crystals that shattered before they hit the ground. Elias Kane sat alone beside his fire in a shallow canyon just south of Raton Pass, New Mexico territory. He was 41 years old, though he looked 60. His face was leather stretched over stone. His eyes the color of smoke after a barn fire. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 9 days. He preferred it that way. People had a habit of disappointing him, and he had a habit of disappointing them right back, usually at the end of a pistol. He heard her before he saw her. A shuffling in the darkness. The snap of a frozen branch. Then silence, the kind of silence that means something alive is standing just beyond the firelight, deciding whether to step forward or run. She stepped forward. She was maybe 20 years old, wrapped in a blanket so thin it might as well have been made of cobwebs. Her lips were blue. Her dark hair was tangled with ice. She was shaking so violently that when she opened her mouth, it took 3 tries before the words came out. May I warm up by your fire? Elias studied her for a long moment. Then he said 6 words that would change everything for both of them. Sit down. But no one thing. What he told her next, and what happened in the days that followed, would become one of the most extraordinary stories ever whispered around campfires across the American frontier. A story of blood, redemption, and the terrifying cost of mercy in a land that had no use for it. Elias Kane was not the name he was born with. That name, the real one, he had buried in a shallow grave outside Abilene, Kansas 6 years earlier, along with the life that went with it. He had been someone else once. A husband, a father, a man who believed the world had a basic sense of fairness woven into its fabric, like thread through a quilt. He had been wrong about that, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. In 1867, Elias, then going by his birth name of Samuel Harding, had been a homesteader on 160 acres of Kansas prairie. He had a wife named Charlotte, a daughter named Rose who was 4, and a son named Thomas who was 2. He raised wheat and a small herd of cattle. He went to church on Sundays. He said grace before meals. He was, by every account, an unremarkable and decent man living an unremarkable and decent life. Then the Comancheros came. They rode in on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 7 men on stolen horses, armed with repeating rifles they had traded whiskey and guns to the Comanche to obtain. They were led by a half-Mexican, half-Irish outlaw named Declan Montoya, a man so cruel that even the most hardened bandits along the Cimarron Cutoff refused to ride with him. Montoya didn't rob for money. He robbed for the pleasure of watching people lose everything they had ever loved. Samuel was in the north field when he heard Charlotte scream. By the time he reached the house, it was already burning. He found Charlotte in the doorway. She had been shot twice, once in the stomach, once in the chest. She was still alive when he reached her. She looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only sorrow, and she whispered a single sentence that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. I couldn't get to them in time. Rose and Thomas were inside the house. Samuel tried to go in after them. The heat drove him back. He tried again, and again. The 3rd time, the roof collapsed, and a burning timber struck him across the shoulders, leaving a scar that ran from his left shoulder blade to the base of his spine. A scar he carried like a brand, a permanent reminder of his failure. Charlotte died in his arms 20 minutes later, there in the dirt of their front yard, while the embers of their home drifted overhead like orange stars falling from a poisoned sky. Something broke inside Samuel Harding that evening. Not cracked, not bent, broke, the way a bone breaks when it is struck with a hammer, clean, total, and beyond any repair. He buried his family in 3 graves beneath the cottonwood tree where Charlotte used to read to the children on summer afternoons. He hammered together 3 crosses from fence posts. And then he stood there for an entire day and night, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing, staring at the turned earth and understanding for the first time that God, if there was one, had no interest in fairness whatsoever. On the morning of the second day, he walked to the barn, the only structure the Comancheros had left standing, and retrieved his father's old Colt Dragoon revolver from where it hung on a nail above the feed bin. He loaded it, he tucked it into his belt, and he began walking south. It took him 14 months to find Declan Montoya and his men. 14 months of tracking, asking questions in cantinas and trading posts, sleeping in arroyos and on the floors of abandoned missions. He became someone else during that time. The softness left his eyes. The gentleness left his hands. He stopped saying grace before meals. He stopped going to church. He stopped believing in anything except the weight of the revolver against his hip and the certainty of what he was going to do with it. He found Montoya in a town called Mesilla, in the New Mexico territory, drinking mezcal in a cantina called La Paloma. Montoya was sitting with 3 of his men. The other 4 had scattered, drifted into other gangs, other territories. Samuel didn't care about the others. Not yet. He wanted the head of the snake. He walked into that cantina on a Thursday evening, and he did not walk out for 20 minutes. When he finally emerged, he was covered in blood. Most of it not his own, and 4 men lay dead on the cantina floor. He had killed Montoya last, deliberately, making sure the man saw his face and understood exactly why he was dying. After Mesilla, Samuel Harding ceased to exist. He chose the name Elias Kane at random from a gravestone in a churchyard in Socorro, borrowing the identity of a man who had died of cholera in 1852. He drifted. He took work where he could find it. Cattle drives, hired gun, sometimes the wrong side of the law, sometimes the right side, mostly the gray and lawless space between. By 1873, Elias Kane had a reputation. Not a famous one. He wasn't Wild Bill Hickok or John Wesley Hardin. But in certain circles, among certain people, his name carried weight. He was known as a man who was fast with a gun, slow to speak, and dangerous to cross. He was known as a man who rode alone and preferred it that way. He was also known as a man who, despite everything, had never once harmed a woman or a child. This detail was important. It was, perhaps, the only thread connecting Elias Kane back to the man he had been, the man who had said grace and read scripture and believed in a world that made sense. And it was this detail, this single remaining shred of who he used to be, that would determine everything that happened on that frozen November night when a shaking young woman stepped into his firelight and asked to warm herself by his flames. "Sit down." "But know one thing," Elias said, his voice flat and worn as old saddle leather. "I don't ask questions and I don't answer them. You warm yourself, you rest, and come morning, you go your way and I go mine." The girl said nothing. She simply collapsed beside the fire as if her legs had been waiting for permission to give out. She extended her hands toward the flames, and Elias noticed they were raw and cracked, the knuckles swollen, the fingernails broken down to the quick. These were not the hands of a saloon girl or a rancher's daughter. These were the hands of someone who had been working or running for a very long time. He poured coffee from the battered tin pot that sat on a flat stone beside the fire and held the cup out to her without a word. She took it with both hands and drank. The heat of it seemed to reach something deep inside her, because a sound escaped her lips. Not quite a sob, not quite a sigh, but something in between. Something that sounded like relief so profound it bordered on grief. Elias returned his gaze to the fire. He was a man of his word. He had said he wouldn't ask questions, and he wouldn't. But that didn't mean he stopped observing. A man didn't survive 6 years in the territories by ignoring the details. Detail 1. She was wearing a dress that had once been fine. Blue calico with white stitching at the collar. Now it was torn and filthy, the hem shredded, but the fabric and the cut suggested money. Or at least proximity to money at some point in her recent past. Detail 2. There was a bruise on the left side of her face, along the jawline, roughly the size and shape of a man's fist. It was maybe 3 days old, judging by the yellow-green edges. Beside it, near her temple, was a fresher mark, darker, still swollen. Someone had hit her, more than once. Detail 3. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from what appeared to be a flour sack, and even through the wrapping, he could see that they were bleeding. Detail 4. And this was the one that made Elias's hand drift unconsciously toward his holster. There was a rope burn around her left wrist. Not the kind you get from handling cattle or tying down a wagon cover. The kind you get from being tied up. From being kept. She finished the coffee and set the cup down carefully, as if it were made of glass instead of tin. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were brown, almost black, and they held something he recognized. A look he had seen in his own reflection in still water on the mornings after the worst nights. It was the look of someone who had seen the very bottom of what human beings were capable of, and who had somehow clawed their way back to the surface. "Thank you," she said. Elias nodded. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The fire crackled and popped. The wind screamed overhead, but the canyon walls sheltered them from the worst of it. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered, and then the night was quiet again. She spoke once more before she slept. "My name is Alma." He didn't respond. He had said he wouldn't ask questions. He hadn't said he would acknowledge answers to questions he hadn't asked. But the name settled somewhere inside him, like a stone dropping into deep water. Alma. She slept sitting up, her back against a rock, her chin on her chest, the thin blanket pulled around her shoulders. Even in sleep, she shook. Whether from cold or from something worse, Elias couldn't tell. He watched her for a while, telling himself it was caution, not concern. Then he stood, crossed to his horse, and pulled his own bedroll from behind the saddle. It was a heavy wool blanket, army surplus, the kind that could keep a man warm in a blizzard. He draped it over her shoulders without waking her, then returned to his side of the fire and sat with his back against his saddle, his revolver in his lap, his eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. He didn't sleep that night, not because of her. He rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours at a stretch anymore. The dreams wouldn't let him. Charlotte's face, the sound of the roof collapsing, the heat, always the heat. But that night, something else kept him awake. Something he hadn't felt in years. A feeling so unfamiliar it took him nearly an hour to identify it. Responsibility. He had told her the terms. Warm yourself. Rest. Come morning, go your way. He had meant it. He was not in the business of saving people. He had tried that once, and he had failed so completely that the failure had consumed every other part of his identity. He was Elias Kane now. Elias Kane rode alone. Elias Kane owed nothing to nobody. But as the night wore on and the fire burned low and the girl called Alma shivered beneath his blanket, Elias felt the edges of his certainty begin to fray. Because he had seen the rope burns. He had seen the bruises. He had seen the look in her eyes. And some part of him, some stubborn, indestructible fragment of Samuel Harding that had survived the fire in Abilene and the killing in Messia and 6 years of wandering, understood that whatever she was running from, it was not finished with her yet. Dawn came gray and reluctant, as if the sun itself was uncertain about facing another day in the territory. Elias built up the fire and put coffee on. He fried salt pork in a small iron skillet and heated a biscuit he had bought 3 days earlier in Trinidad. He set food beside Alma without speaking and moved away. She woke slowly, disoriented, blinking at the canyon walls and the pale sky as if she couldn't remember how she had arrived there. Then her eyes found him, and something in her face shifted. Not trust, exactly, but the faintest shadow of it. The possibility of trust. The memory of what trust used to feel like before someone burned it out of her. She ate every bite of food he had set out. She drank 2 cups of coffee. And then she stood, folded his blanket with precise, careful movements, and set it beside the fire. "I should go," she said quietly. Elias looked at her bare, bleeding feet. He looked at the bruises on her face. He looked at the rope burns on her wrist. And then he heard himself say something he had not planned to say, something that violated every rule he had built his survival around for the last 6 years. Where? It was one word, one syllable, but it cracked something open between them, and what spilled out would drown them both before it was done. Alma stared at him for a long moment after he asked that single word. Her lips parted, then closed. She looked away, toward the mouth of the canyon, where the trail wound south through scrub juniper and red rock. Then she looked back at him. "Away," she said. "Just away." Elias should have let it go. He should have nodded, tipped his hat, saddled his horse and ridden north. That was what Elias Kane would do. That was what 6 years of carefully constructed solitude demanded. Instead, he asked another question. Away from who? The look she gave him then was not one of gratitude. It was one of pure, crystalline terror. Not terror of him. Terror that if she spoke the name aloud, it would somehow summon the thing she feared, like a demon called forth by its true name in some old preacher's fire and brimstone sermon. "His name is Garrett Sully," she said, barely above a whisper. And then she told him everything. Garrett Sully was a rancher who operated a vast spread along the Vermejo River, north of Cimarron in Colfax County. On paper, he was a legitimate businessman, a cattleman, a landowner, a pillar of the nascent community. In reality, he was something far worse. Sully had come west after the war, a former Confederate officer from Georgia who had lost everything in Sherman's march and who had rebuilt himself in the territories through a combination of ruthlessness, violence, and the casual corruption of every law enforcement official within 100 miles. Sully ran his ranch with a labor force that existed in a gray space between employment and slavery. He recruited, a generous word for what he actually did, young women from the immigrant trains that passed through the territory. Women traveling alone. Women who had no family, no connections, no one who would come looking for them. He offered them work, room and board, safety, the promise of a new life in the West. What he gave them was servitude. They cooked, they cleaned, they worked the ranch. And at night, Sully and his men used them for whatever they pleased. Any woman who tried to leave was beaten. Those who persisted were locked in a root cellar beneath the main house, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until the fight went out of them. 2 women had died in that cellar. Alma knew this because she had heard their screams stop. Alma had arrived at Sully's ranch 8 months earlier. She was originally from Pennsylvania, the daughter of a coal miner who had died in a tunnel collapse when she was 12. Her mother had died of consumption 2 years after that. At 16, Alma had been placed in a textile mill in Scranton. At 18, she had used every penny of her savings to buy passage on a wagon train heading west, chasing the dream that every immigrant chased. Land, freedom, a chance to be something more than a cog in someone else's machine. The wagon train had dissolved in chaos somewhere in eastern Colorado. Disputes over water rights, a broken axle, a diphtheria outbreak that killed 6 people in 10 days. Alma had found herself stranded in Trinidad with no money, no provisions, and no prospects. That was where Sully's man had found her, a smooth-talking cowhand named Virgil Poole, who spoke of the Sully Ranch the way a revival preacher speaks of heaven. Good food, clean quarters, fair wages, a family atmosphere. The first 3 weeks had been bearable. The work was hard but honest. Then Sully noticed her. After that, nothing was bearable ever again. She spared Elias the details of what Sully had done to her. She didn't need to provide them. The bruises and the rope burns and the broken fingernails told the story more eloquently than words ever could. She had escaped 4 nights ago. She had waited until Sully and most of his men rode out to deal with a dispute at the northern boundary of his range. Something about a fence line and a neighbor's cattle. The man left to guard the women, a slow-witted hand named Poke, had fallen asleep after drinking most of a bottle of rye whiskey. Alma had taken a kitchen knife, cut the rope that bound her ankle to an iron ring in the floor, and climbed out through a window. She had been walking south ever since. For days. No food. No shoes. She had left them behind in her haste to flee. She had drunk from streams and eaten nothing but a handful of juniper berries that had made her violently ill. She had been heading, vaguely, for Raton Pass, with some half-formed notion of reaching a town, any town where she could beg for help. But she knew, and Elias could see it in her eyes, that Sully would be coming. Sully always came. He was not the kind of man who let things go. Letting things go implied weakness, and weakness was the one thing Garrett Sully would not tolerate. 2 of the 3 women who had tried to escape before Alma had been brought back. The third, the one who had made it furthest, nearly reaching Springer before Sully's men caught her, had been brought back too, but she had never been the same afterward. Whatever they had done to her had broken something beyond repair. She sat in a corner of the kitchen now, they said, rocking back and forth, staring at walls and speaking to people who were not there. When Alma finished speaking, the canyon was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the distant moan of the wind. Elias sat very still, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the flames. Somewhere deep inside him, in a place he had walled off with years of whiskey and silence and violence, Samuel Harding stirred. Samuel Harding, who had arrived too late to save his own family. Samuel Harding, who had stood in the ashes of his home and sworn that he would never again allow himself to care about another human being, because caring was just another word for giving the world a weapon to use against you. But Samuel Harding had also been a man who believed, despite everything, despite the fire and the graves and the killing, that some things were simply wrong. Not complicated. Not debatable. Wrong. And what Garrett Sully was doing to those women was wrong in the most fundamental, bone-deep, inarguable sense of the word. Elias stood. He walked to his horse. For a moment, Alma thought he was leaving. She could see it in the way her face collapsed, the way hope drained from her eyes like water through cracked clay. But he didn't mount. Instead, he opened his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of wool socks, a spare shirt, and a pouch of dried beef. He brought them back and set them at her feet. "Put the socks on," he said. "Eat something." She stared at him. "You said come morning. I go my way and you go yours. I changed my mind." "Why?" Elias looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it yet, and it carried the weight of 6 years of grief compressed into a single sentence. "Because I once came home too late to save the people I loved. I will not make that mistake again. Not while I still draw breath." They had 2 days. That was Elias's calculation, based on what Alma told him about how far Sully's ranch was and how fast his men could ride. 2 days before the wolves came sniffing down the trail. He used those 2 days wisely. He moved their camp deeper into the canyon, to a spot where the walls narrowed to barely 20 feet across and the only approach was a winding trail that forced riders into single file. It was a defensible position, not perfect, but better than the open flat where he had originally made camp. He gathered firewood. He rationed their food. He cleaned his revolver 3 times, not because it needed it, but because the ritual steadied his hands and focused his mind. Alma watched him work with a mixture of bewilderment and something that might have been wonder. She had spent the last 8 months surrounded by men who used their strength to dominate and destroy. She had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that strength could be used to protect. That a man could move through the world with quiet competence and deliberate care, building shelter instead of tearing it down. On the second evening, as they sat by the fire eating the last of the dried beef and the hardtack Elias had been saving, she asked him about his past. He was silent for so long that she assumed he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, he told her. Not everything. Not the details of the killing in Messia, but the rest of it. Charlotte, Rose, Thomas, the fire, the graves beneath the cottonwood tree. When he finished, Alma was crying. Not for herself. She had exhausted her own tears months ago. She was crying for him, for the man he had been, for the family he had lost, for the years of wandering and emptiness that stretched behind him like a road through a desert that had no end. "Do you think they would forgive you?" she asked quietly. "Your wife, your children, for what you've become." The question hit Elias like a physical blow. He actually flinched. This man who had faced down armed outlaws without blinking, who had ridden through Indian territory alone, who had been shot twice and stabbed once and had never made a sound. He flinched at a question from a bruised, barefoot girl who weighed maybe 100 pounds. "I don't know," he said, and he meant it. It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said in 6 years. They came on the morning of the 3rd day. Elias heard the horses first. He was a light sleeper. Those 3 or 4 hours he managed were shallow and fragile, easily shattered by any sound that didn't belong. The sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground at dawn did not belong. He was on his feet with his revolver drawn before the echo faded. "Stay behind the rocks," he told Alma. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." She grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so thin and battered. "There will be too many of them," she said. "You can't fight them all." "Probably not," he agreed. "But I can make it expensive." He moved to the narrow entrance of the inner canyon and took a position behind a boulder that gave him a clear line of sight down the trail. He counted the riders as they came into view around the bend. Five men on horseback, riding in a loose column, rifles across their saddle bows. At the front, on a tall sorrel horse, rode a man who could only be Garrett Sully. Sully was big. Not fat, but thick the way old oak trees are thick. He had a red beard going gray at the edges and small, pale eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting any of it back. He wore a long duster coat and a flat-brimmed hat, and across his lap he carried a Sharps rifle that looked like it could drop a buffalo at 500 yards. Behind Sully rode Virgil Poole, the smooth talker, the recruiter, the man who lured women to the ranch with promises of paradise. He was lean and handsome in a predatory way, with a thin mustache and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Next to Poole rode a massive man with no visible neck and hands the size of dinner plates. This would be the enforcer, the one who did the beating and the breaking when Sully gave the order. The last two were ranch hands, nondescript, interchangeable, the kind of men who followed orders without thinking because thinking was not a skill they had ever cultivated. Sully reined up 50 yards from the canyon entrance. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no, or rather, who had systematically destroyed everyone who had ever tried. "I know you're in there," Sully called out, his voice booming off the canyon walls. "And I know you've got something that belongs to me." Elias said nothing. "I'm a reasonable man," Sully continued, and the lie was so enormous it seemed to distort the air around him. "Send the girl out and you can ride away. No harm done. No hard feelings. This doesn't concern you." Elias still said nothing. He was calculating. 5 men. He had 6 rounds in his revolver and another 6 in a spare cylinder in his coat pocket. His Henry rifle was back at the camp with Alma, which was a mistake. He should have brought it. 12 rounds against 5 men. The math was possible, but only if everything went perfectly, and nothing in Elias Kane's life had ever gone perfectly. "Last chance, stranger." Sully's voice hardened. The veneer of reasonableness cracked like thin ice over black water. "Send her out or we're coming in. And if we have to come in, I promise you, you will die slow." Elias took a breath. He steadied his hand. He thought of Charlotte, and of Rose and Thomas, and of the graves beneath the cottonwood tree. He thought of Alma, shaking in the firelight, asking permission to warm herself. He thought of the rope burns on her wrist and the bruises on her face and the women who had died in Sully's cellar. Then he stepped out from behind the boulder, raised his revolver, and fired. The first shot took Virgil Poole through the throat. It was a deliberate choice. Take the recruiter first. The man who lured the innocent. The silver-tongued devil who made the whole operation possible. Poole toppled from his horse without a sound, dead before he hit the frozen ground. All hell broke loose. The canyon erupted with the sound of gunfire, the sharp crack of rifles and the deep bark of revolvers echoing off stone walls until it sounded like a full-scale battle instead of 1 man against 4. Horses screamed and reared. Bullets sparked off rock. The air filled with the acrid smell of black powder smoke that hung in the cold morning air like fog. Elias's second shot hit one of the ranch hands in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle but not dropping him. His third shot missed entirely as Sully's sorrel horse bucked and sidestepped, throwing off his aim. He ducked back behind the boulder as a volley of return fire chewed into the rock, sending chips of stone flying past his face like shrapnel. He pressed his back against the boulder, his heart hammering. 4 men still standing. 4 rounds left in the cylinder. The spare cylinder was in his coat pocket. Reloading would cost him precious seconds. Seconds he might not have. He heard Sully barking orders. "Briggs, go right. Henshaw, dismount and work up the left side. We'll pin him down and come over the top." They were going to flank him. Elias had chosen his position well. The narrow canyon approach forced them into a bottleneck, but the walls, while steep, were not impossible to climb. A determined man could scramble up the left side where the rock was broken and terraced, find a position above and behind him, and shoot down. If that happened, it was over. Elias made a decision. Waiting was dying. He had to move. He broke from cover and sprinted across the narrow canyon floor to a jumble of fallen rocks on the opposite side. Bullets kicked up dirt at his heels. One tugged at his coat sleeve like an insistent child. He threw himself behind the rocks and came up firing. His fourth shot caught Briggs, the enormous enforcer, in the chest. The big man staggered but didn't fall. He was wearing a thick leather vest over a wool coat, and the ball had lost enough energy passing through all that material that it didn't penetrate deep enough to kill. But it hurt him. He dropped his rifle and clutched at his chest, and that gave Elias the opening he needed. His fifth shot hit Briggs in the face, and the big man went down like a felled tree, crashing to the frozen ground with a thud that Elias felt through his boots. 2 down. 1 wounded. 2 unharmed. 2 rounds left. The wounded ranch hand, the one he had hit in the shoulder, had dismounted and taken cover behind his horse, using the animal as a shield. Elias would not shoot a horse. It was one of his rules, irrational perhaps in a gunfight where his life hung in the balance. But Samuel Harding had loved horses, and some things survived even the complete demolition of a man's identity. That left Henshaw, the other ranch hand, who was already scrambling up the left wall of the canyon, just as Sully had ordered. And Sully himself, who had dismounted and taken a position behind a thick juniper trunk at the canyon entrance. His Sharps rifle braced against the wood, waiting for a clear shot. Elias knew the Sharps. He knew what that gun could do. At this range, maybe 40 yards, a Sharps round would pass through the rock he was hiding behind like a fist through wet paper. If Sully got a clear shot, no amount of cover would save him. He heard the scrape of boots on rock above and to his left. Henshaw climbing. 20 seconds, maybe 30, before the man reached a position where he could fire down into Elias's cover. This was it. The arithmetic of survival had narrowed to a razor's edge. Elias did something that surprised even himself. He stood up, fully, in the open, exposed. Sully saw him and swung the Sharps, but Elias wasn't looking at Sully. He was looking at Henshaw, who had frozen halfway up the canyon wall, startled by the sudden appearance of his target in the open. Elias raised his revolver and fired his 6th and final round. Henshaw tumbled from the wall and landed in a heap at its base, motionless. The Sharps boomed. The round hit the rock where Elias had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. He had dropped flat the instant after firing, a move born of instinct and experience, and the heavy ball passed through the space where his chest had been and buried itself in the canyon wall behind him with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. Elias rolled behind cover, his revolver empty. His hands moved with the practiced speed of a man who had done this before under fire. He thumbed the cylinder pin, dropped the spent cylinder, and slammed the loaded spare into place. 6 fresh rounds. But Sully was already reloading the Sharps, and that gun was a single-shot weapon. Elias had maybe 8 seconds before Sully was ready to fire again. He used 5 of them to sprint forward, closing the distance between himself and the juniper where Sully was positioned. He covered 30 of the 40 yards before Sully got the breech closed and the hammer cocked. Sully swung the rifle toward him, but at 10 yards, a long-barreled Sharps was unwieldy, slow to aim. A revolver was not. Elias fired twice. Both rounds hit Sully in the torso. The big man staggered backward, dropping the Sharps. But he didn't fall. He reached for the pistol on his hip with a snarl of rage that was almost inhuman. His pale eyes blazing with the fury of a man who could not comprehend that his dominion was ending. His hand closed around the grip of his pistol and he began to draw. Then a shot rang out from behind Elias. Not his revolver. The sharper, lighter crack of a Henry rifle. Sully's head snapped back. He stood for a moment, swaying, his pistol half-drawn, his eyes already empty. Then he collapsed. Elias turned. Alma stood at the inner entrance of the canyon. His Henry rifle pressed against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale but steady. Her hands, those broken, cracked, brutalized hands, did not shake. The wounded ranch hand, still hiding behind his horse, threw his pistol into the dirt and raised his hands above his head. "Don't shoot!" he screamed. "I'm done. I surrender. For God's sake, don't shoot." Elias looked at Alma. She looked at him. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a conscious thought, but something deeper. An understanding. An acknowledgement that what had just happened had bound them together in a way that could never be entirely undone. Elias walked over to the surrendering ranch hand, disarmed him completely, and tied him to a tree with his own lariat. "When someone finds you," Elias said, "tell them what Garrett Sully was. Tell them what he did to those women. Tell them everything." The man nodded frantically, tears streaming down his dirty face. Elias turned back to Alma. She had lowered the rifle and was staring at Sully's body with an expression that was impossible to read. Relief, maybe. Horror, maybe. Freedom, certainly. But beneath all of it, something else. The dawning realization that the monster she had feared for 8 months was just a man, and that men could die, and that some of them deserved to. They rode north together, Alma on Sully's sorrel, Elias on his own bay mare, through the pass and into Colorado. They didn't speak much that first day. There are some experiences that require silence afterward, the way a wound requires stillness to begin healing. The violence of the morning hung between them like smoke, present but slowly dissipating, carried away by the wind and the miles. On the second day, they stopped in Trinidad, where Elias used the last of his money to buy Alma a pair of proper boots, a warm coat, and a meal at the hotel dining room. She ate roast beef and potatoes and 2 slices of apple pie, and she cried while she ate, not from sadness but from the overwhelming strangeness of sitting in a warm room, wearing clean clothes, eating food she had not been forced to cook for someone else. The simple, devastating miracle of being treated like a human being. Over that meal, she asked him the question he had been waiting for, the question he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "What happens now?" Elias set down his fork. He looked at her across the table. This young woman who had survived things that would have broken most people beyond repair, who had walked 4 days through frozen mountains with no shoes, who had picked up a rifle she had never fired before and killed a man to save another man she had known for barely 2 days. He saw something in her that he recognized. Not weakness, not victimhood, strength. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't swagger or boast, but simply endures quietly and stubbornly, long after louder and flashier forms of strength have burned themselves out. "That depends on you," he said. "I have nothing," she said. "No money, no family, no place to go. You have yourself. That's more than most people can say." She considered this. "And you? Where will you go?" Elias was quiet for a long time. Through the window of the dining room, he could see the main street of Trinidad. Wagons rumbling past, cowboys on horseback, women in bonnets carrying market baskets. Ordinary life. The kind of life he had once lived and had believed he would never live again. "There's a place," he said slowly, as if the words were forming themselves without his permission. "Up north, near Pueblo. A man I did some work for a few years back, a rancher named Hollister. He told me once that if I ever wanted to stop running, he had land he'd sell me cheap. 100 acres. Small creek. Good grass. You said you rode alone." "I did. Past tense." He looked at her. "I said a lot of things, Alma. Most of them were lies I told myself to keep from feeling anything. A man who doesn't feel anything doesn't get hurt. But he doesn't live either. He just exists. Like a rock. Like a fence post. I've been a fence post for 6 years, and I am tired of it." Alma leaned forward across the table. "Then stop." 2 words. Simple as breathing. Impossible as resurrection. And yet, sitting there in that dining room in Trinidad, Colorado, with the smell of coffee and apple pie and with smoke in the air, Elias Kane felt something shift inside his chest. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a lightning bolt of redemption. Something quieter. something that felt like the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth after a wildfire. Tentative, fragile, easily destroyed, but alive. Undeniably, stubbornly, miraculously alive. They rode north the next morning. Together. It took them 6 days to reach Hollister's ranch outside Pueblo. The rancher, a weathered old Vermonter with kind eyes and a firm handshake, remembered Elias and honored his offer. 100 acres at the base of the foothills, with a creek running through it and a small cabin that needed work but had 4 walls and a roof and a stone fireplace that drew well. Elias bought the land with money he earned over the next 3 months working cattle for Hollister. Alma took a position as a schoolteacher in the nearby settlement of Fountain. It turned out that the coal miner's daughter from Pennsylvania had attended school through 8th grade, which made her one of the most educated people in the territory. And the settlement's children needed teaching desperately enough that no one asked too many questions about her past. They built a life. Not quickly. Not easily. There were dark nights when Elias sat by the fire and stared into the flames and saw Charlotte's face and heard the roof collapsing and felt the heat on his skin. There were mornings when Alma woke screaming from dreams of the cellar and the rope and the sound of Sully's boots on the stairs. The past did not release them willingly. It clung to them like burrs in wool, sharp and persistent, drawing blood at unexpected moments. But they endured. Together. Not as lovers, not at first, not for a long time. As something harder to define and perhaps more valuable. As 2 people who had seen each other at their most broken and had chosen, despite everything, to stay, to bear witness to each other's pain, to sit in silence on the hard nights and in conversation on the good ones and to build, slowly and deliberately, a structure of mutual trust strong enough to withstand the storms that the territory, and their own memories, threw at them. In the spring of 1875, Elias rode back to Abilene. He found the homestead, now abandoned and overgrown, the charred remains of the house barely visible beneath the prairie grass that had reclaimed the land. He found the cottonwood tree. He found the 3 graves. He knelt there for a long time. He spoke to Charlotte. He spoke to Rose and Thomas. He told them about Alma. He told them about the ranch. He told them that he was trying to be something other than a ghost, trying to honor their memory not with violence but with the daily, unglamorous, infinitely difficult work of living. He asked for their forgiveness. He didn't know if he received it, but when he stood up and walked back to his horse, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not free of the past, he would never be free of it, but no longer crushed beneath its weight, carrying it instead, the way a man carries a scar. Always present, always visible, but no longer the thing that defines him. He rode back to Colorado, back to the ranch, back to Alma, who was standing on the porch of the cabin when he arrived, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching for him the way someone watches for a ship returning to harbor. "Welcome home," she said, and for the first time in 6 years, Elias Kane, born Samuel Harding, reborn in fire and blood and mercy, believed that the word meant something. Years later, travelers passing through the foothills south of Pueblo would sometimes stop at a small ranch by a clear creek. There they would find a quiet man with smoke-colored eyes and a dark-haired woman who taught the local children to read. The way they moved around each other wasn't the bright affection of new love, but the calm, unshakable ease of 2 people who had survived fire together. On quiet nights, if the travelers stayed long enough and the fire burned low, the woman would sometimes tell the story, how she once stumbled out of the darkness, barefoot and half-frozen, whispering to a stranger, "May I warm up by your fire?" and how his answer changed everything. "Sit down, but know one thing. Everyone who sits at my fire is safe." A simple promise from a broken man to a broken stranger on the coldest night of the year. But the West was built on promises like that. Moments when ordinary people chose mercy instead of cruelty, connection instead of fear, hope instead of despair. Elias and Alma Kane were proof of it. And on cold November nights, when the wind howls down from the mountains and the fire burns low, you can almost still hear it. "May I warm up by your fire? Everyone who sits at my fire is safe." Some promises outlast the people who make them. This was one of them.